Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythologies. Tonight, we are going back to the very beginning. We are going to get into an old school conspiracy theory featuring everybody's favorite subject, NASA. NASA and the space race is where this show began, and I will continue to talk about it for the rest of time because everything awesome always comes out of this. And no, we're not actually talking about the moon landing this time. For this conspiracy, you actually have to accept that the moon landing did happen, which it actually did. And yes, one day I will touch on my personal thoughts about the moon landing conspiracy theories. However, this is a conspiracy that has been floating around the internet since about 2006, and I really want to get into it now. This is the story of Apollo 20. And yes, we're probably already thinking Apollo 20, well, that never happened. It was canceled. Apollo ended after 17. What's this about? But what if I were to tell you that Apollos 18 through 20 did launch? And the reason that these stories were never made public is due to the nature of these missions, because these missions weren't about going to the moon and collecting more rocks. These three missions were classified because they were set out to investigate an alien presence on the moon. But I am jumping ahead of myself. Let's start where we always do, right at the beginning. And this time I'm gonna start with some of NASA's earliest programs and go through Apollo, because these stories all do kind of piggyback on top of each other and eventually lead us to Apollo 20. So naturally, when it comes to the space race, a good place to start is on October 4th, 1957. Why is that date significant? Because that's the date Sputnik was launched. And we all know Sputnik. It was basically a glorified basketball with some antennae that sent a radio signal to the Earth for about 3 weeks before its batteries died, and then it eventually loses altitude and burns up in the atmosphere. And the news of this satellite going up is a complete shock to the American public. It comes out of nowhere. And the reason that this event sends a shock through the American populace can really be blamed on the government itself, because since the end of World War II, we were really developing our rocket program, our intercontinental ballistic missile program, in secret through the military, so that news just wasn't as accessible. And simply due to that lack of information in the public about our intercontinental ballistic missile program, it leads to this mindset amongst the general populace that, hey, the Russians are way ahead of us in this technology, we need to catch up. And these fears really got exacerbated amongst the populace of the US a month later when they launched Laika into orbit on Sputnik 2, which to this day I still think it's awesome that the first living creature ever sent into space was a dog, especially given how humans and dogs have kind of this symbiotic relationship, which goes back to when we first domesticated to them. And I mean, dogs are awesome, so why couldn't the first thing in space be a dog? To be honest, a dog was probably much more deserving to go into space first as opposed to a human, but I digress. But the problem is, all this development in this missile technology is under the charge of the United States military, and President Eisenhower, who was unable to disclose details of military space projects just due to them being top secret, he's basically pressured to create a civilian space agency, primarily just to show the public that, hey, yes, we are working on this research and we are interested in space exploration, and we couldn't tell you just because it was all classified before, but here we're going to declassify all this and to make it as transparent as we can without sacrificing our national security. So essentially they create NASA in 58 and get to work, and the first of these projects is the Mercury project, and it really only had one goal, and that was to get a guy into space. However, the overarching mission is to basically just act as a propaganda campaign in order to ease American minds that we are beating the Soviets into space. I mean, there's a reason why we televise everything NASA does. So pretty much the first thing they do is they launched the satellite Explorer 1 in 1958. It's kind of America's answer to Sputnik. And then they go right into the question of how do we get a dude into space? So they employ thousands of scientists from across the country to all work on this one problem. And it's not just scientists, it's people from all walks of life. It's people who work in manufacturing facilities. They need welders, they need guys to pour concrete. Hell, they need janitors. They need engineers who can solve these complex complex problems and doctors who can ask the right questions in order for us to even see if a human can survive in space. So it becomes this huge national movement to accomplish this goal of getting a dude into space, which we eventually accomplish, and that leads to the Gemini program, which lays the groundwork for Apollo. And Apollo finally gets us to the moon in 1969. And for a lot of people, the space race ends with us getting to the moon in 1969. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, they're up there, they plant the flag, they come back safely, and that's the end of the story. It's this huge victory for the United States, but NASA carries on because they have 20 Apollo missions planned. However, getting to the moon once, that was the big event, so most Americans, they kind of stopped paying attention. Now, most of us probably do remember Apollo 13, and most of us just remember that because it led to the O2 canister explosion, which led to them having to abort the mission, and it was heads or tails whether or not they'd even get home. But the problem is, in the months and weeks heading up to that disaster, interest in the space program was dwindling. I mean, they didn't even show the launch. It got preempted by something else on television because it just wasn't popular or newsworthy anymore. Then subsequently, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all went up with very little fanfare. I think it was said at one point that the idea of going to the moon became as mundane as getting in your car and being in your early commute. And by the end of Apollo 17, they had decided to basically focus on other things, primarily looking into work on space stations and the shuttle program and etc., etc. And because of this, Apollos 18 through 20 were canceled. At least they were officially canceled, because it was something found from photos taken during Apollo 15 which sparked more interest in some, let's just say, dark corners of NASA and the military. And they decided that we need to go back to the moon again to investigate this in secret. Now, what this was a photograph taken during Apollo 15 as it orbited over the Del Porte region on the backside of the moon. And one of these photographs, which is a real NASA photograph, you can actually download it. The image is called AS15-P-9625. It shows the Del Porte region, which has this very strange object sitting in a crater. It's about 2 miles long and about 450 feet high. And when you initially look at it, you think maybe it's some weird kind of mountain range or something, but it's in fact an alien spacecraft that is said to be almost 1 billion years old. And that would lead to the final Apollo missions. Now, Apollo 18 actually had a different mission in place. It was actually part of an anti-Soviet program in order to install a payload which would act as an early warning detector for ICBM attacks. And this mission actually accomplished 3 different things. For one, they were able to install the early warning system against intercontinental ballistic missile attacks. 2, they were able to determine a secret Soviet presence on the moon that never returned. And 3, they were able to verify the existence of alien life on the moon. Now, this all took place in December 1974 at the South Pole of the moon. So the story essentially goes that in December 1974, Commander Nathan Walker, Lieutenant Colonel John Gray, and Captain Ben Anderson are launched on Apollo 18, and their target is the South Pole of the moon. Now, a lot of people allege that this launch was done in secret. However, given the fact that no one was paying attention to Saturn V launches anymore, and the fact there was no news or radio coverage of it, pretty much says that they didn't really have to worry too much about secrecy. No one was paying attention to NASA anymore at this point. So they make the 3-day trip to the moon, and Colonel Gray, he stays aboard the Apollo Command Module in orbit, while Walker and Anderson land at the South Pole on the Apollo lunar module named Liberty. So on Christmas Day, while planting the ICBM detector, they take rock samples, which Anderson describes as feeling strange. So they finish up their work and they collect their samples and they head back to the Liberty to get some rest. Now, while they're resting, the pair hear noises outside of the lunar lander and they contact Houston and they're like, hey, we're hearing these strange noises. Houston says, okay, we'll investigate it. And then they come back later and say, guys, that noise is just noise interference coming from the ICBM module that you set up, and it's just being broadcast over your radios. It's nothing to worry about. So they get on with their mission, and the next day they're continuing with the ICBM detector setup, and Anderson discovers footprints. So they decide to follow these footprints because they're human. And while following these footprints, they come across an abandoned but still functional Soviet LK lander. It looks like it had a hard impact. And only a few yards away from the lander, they come across this crater, and in this crater is a dead cosmonaut. His face shield had been smashed in, and it looks like he'd been there for a while. So they actually contact Houston about this, and Houston tells them, we know about the Soviet presence on the moon. Don't worry about it. Get on with your mission. It's simply a failed moon landing attempt that the Soviets covered up. So they return to their work. Now that night they hear these strange noises again, which Houston continues to tell them is interference from the ICBM module. So on the third day, they finish their work and they're preparing to leave, and they notice that the flag that they had planted had mysteriously disappeared. But with the mission complete, they put it out of their mind and they prepare to leave. However, the launch is aborted because the Liberty suffers violent shaking, and an inspection reveals extensive damage to the module, which happened upon landing. Now, while they're conducting this inspection, they actually find their flag nearby, and it had been shredded, and their lunar module had been tipped up onto its side. And then they also found tracks that didn't make sense leading away from the site. It looks as if the landing site had been raided or trashed by some entity that did not want them there. However, it gets worse, and it seems like this interference from this ICBM module or whatever has increased, and it becomes harder and harder to contact either Houston or Gray. Now, it's at this point when Anderson actually speculates that the true purpose of this ICBM warning device is actually to monitor aliens, which have lived on the moon for millions of years. And he suspects that if they simply turn it off, it would take away this interference. They can reestablish contact with Houston and reestablish contact with the command module. But they have this bigger problem. They can't go anywhere. They're stuck because the Liberty had a hard impact and it is damaged, and it's about to get more damaged. So as they approach the ICBM warning device in an attempt to switch it off, they find that it's been completely destroyed, and the same mysterious tracks are leading away from it back towards the lunar lander. They get back to the Liberty and it's completely destroyed. It's unable to pressurize, the controls are trashed, they're stuck there. And since the Liberty is now depressurized, they don't have an additional source of oxygen, so they realize that the Soviet LK lander is still there. They can still be pressurized, and that could be their source of oxygen, and it could possibly be the answer to their escape. So they head towards this Soviet lander. And for context, they are able to flip the lunar rover back onto its wheels because it was just tipped on its side, and lunar gravity is pretty awesome. However, unfortunately for Anderson and Walker, as they were driving back towards the LK lander, they actually crashed the rover in a crater. Now, Anderson is knocked out and Walker disappears, and he's just gone. It's believed that he may have been taken by this alien presence because he is not seen again. So Anderson makes his way to the Soviet LK, and he uses its radio to contact the Soviet Mission Control, who connect him to the DoD, the American Department of Defense. However, it is at this point when the Deputy Secretary informs Anderson that they are aware of the situation and they cannot allow him to return to Earth because they believe that if he has had contact with this alien presence, that he may be carrying some kind of virus or infection, and they can't risk some kind of alien pandemic wiping out half of humanity. However, at this point, something snaps inside of Anderson. He is not going to accept the same fate as Walker, and he simply refuses that order, and he starts firing up this LK lander. While he's doing this, Gray up there on the command module is informed that Anderson is in that Soviet craft and he's going to try to dock it with the command module, and he should not allow it to dock under any circumstance. His possible contact with this alien life could lead to a pandemic on Earth, and he is simply to just abort this rescue mission and leave. So while Gray begins his preparation for the trip home, Anderson manages to launch this LK lander off of the ground. However, it's so severely damaged that while he's attempting to dock with the command module, he loses control, he comes in too fast, and the last words on the radio are, "LK module, you are approaching too fast. Please change course," and then it cuts out as the LK lander and the command module collide. And that was the end of Apollo 18. Now, their records were doctored to state that they had died in various testing accidents involving jets and the new upcoming shuttle project, and officially that mission never took place. And it is kind of an outlier in these last 3 missions. However, it did definitively state that there was some kind of alien presence on the moon. Now, Apollo 19 was sent out to investigate this presence in this very specific region of the backside of the moon, in the Del Porte region, where this large cigar-like ship is believed to have been. And Apollo 19's mission, which we don't know a lot about, but we do know a little bit about, was to breach this spaceship, bring back artifacts, bring back samples, and try to seek out this alien life which had been discovered during the Apollo 18 mission. Now, given the time frame between 18 and 20, it's believed that Apollo 19 reached the moon sometime in 1975 or early 1976. And they had a very good idea of where exactly to go because the images were from as far back as Apollo 15. However, there are some images I haven't talked about yet, and it was also in the mission briefing of Apollo 19 to investigate these images. These images were of military bases or possible alien cities on the moon. They were these low, domed and mushroom-shaped structures near this crash site of this ancient ship. Now, all we know about 19 is what we pieced together from the accounts from Apollo 20. However, we do know that all members of this mission were killed in one way or another, including whoever was on the command module up there in lunar orbit, which really brings us to Apollo 20. And the secondary mission of Apollo 20 was to find out what happened to the members of Apollo 19. But once again, I'm jumping ahead, so let's start at the beginning of Apollo 20. Now, Apollo 20 was actually a joint American-Soviet mission carried out to investigate this large ship that was on the surface of the moon, this ancient ship, and secondarily to make contact with any aliens who may be living up there, bring back any samples we can find, and also find out what the hell happened to Apollo 19. And yes, you did hear that right, this was a joint US-Soviet mission, and it was actually the Soviets who reached out to the US about conducting this mission because they had these same photographs, and the photographs that were sent out to the public by NASA were doctored, but they had the original undoctored photographs, and they were worried, just like we were worried here in the United States. And since their attempt of getting a man to the moon had ended in failure, the Soviets essentially gave the Americans every piece of intelligence they had on these bases and on this ship. And America said, well, we have the rocket that'll get you there. So on August 13th, 1976, 2 American astronauts and 1 Soviet cosmonaut made their way to the moon. The US crew members were William Rutledge, Leona Snyder, and the Soviet cosmonaut was the infamous Alexei Levinov. On August 16th, 1976, they arrive, and Levinov and Rutledge touch down while Snyder remains in the command module. So Rutledge and Levinov, they land in the lander, they get out the rover, and they start making their ways towards the ship. And Rutledge actually goes on to say that him and Levinov sat there in silence and awe at the size of this thing, because while 2 miles might seem like a short distance, when you're standing in front of something that big and that long, it really takes your breath away. The sheer size of the damn thing was just too big to comprehend. So they park the lunar rover about 800 feet away from the craft, and they start making their way on foot towards it. And they could tell that this thing had been here for a long time. It was ancient. Rutledge goes on to say that it had been here since before man, since before the dinosaurs, and it fascinated him that something that old could be that technologically advanced. He said it was as if us humans looking at it were just rubbing sticks together to make fire in comparison to this culture's technology. And they could tell that this thing was ancient. It was covered in thick layers of moon dust. It had been pockmarked with ancient meteor impacts, but for some reason it had still survived, and they actually were easily able to find a way into the ship. And as they entered, they noticed that the interior walls were greatly different from the exterior walls. They were perfectly smooth, and there was this ambient light coming from somewhere. They couldn't figure it out. So as they stood there in awe, they took a moment to just make sure that they still had radio control with Leona up in orbit in the command module and with ground control down on Earth, which they still did. So they proceeded to go further into the ship. Now, as for the floor of the ship, it had actually had a bunch of lunar dust in it, and it was actually to the point where they could walk on it as if it were a sandy beach. And at one point, they actually found a little pattern in the lunar dust that indicated that there was some kind of fluid flowing. They thought maybe it was a hydraulic leak or something, but no source could be found. So they got to work collecting samples because NASA wanted samples of everything. They wanted samples of the ship's walls, of anything, any organic material that could be found in there. However, they were only really to get samples of the soil because they found that their chisels and hammers made no impact onto the walls. They couldn't even scratch it, let alone break off a chunk to bring home. And they also noticed that inside the ship, the force of gravity was much stronger, as if it were generating its own gravitational field. Which makes sense because being able to generate your own gravity is really instrumental in cracking the code, the formula to deep space or interstellar travel. Because creatures, let's just say humans for example, we really do need gravity to survive. Without gravity, our bone density goes down, our muscles atrophy, our inner ear doesn't really know which way is up, our blood pressure goes out of balance, and even digestion is more difficult without gravity. So you really need to crack that code of generating your own gravitational field if you're gonna conduct any kind of deep space travel. So Rutledge and Levinov, they end up following this path down this hallway which leads to this upper floor which led to this big chamber. And they literally found what they were looking for, signs of life, and even though they knew they were looking for it, it still shocked them when they saw it. And these signs of life appeared to be these dried red vines. It was vegetation. And these vines were all over the walls and kind of scattered all throughout this chamber. And below these plants, there were these trays which were collecting this golden phosphorescent liquid. So they get their little sample things out and they collect about 2 liters of this stuff, which they go on to call golden tears. So they're collecting these golden tears, and Leona up in the command module, she breaks in and she patches them through to Houston. And Houston essentially tells them, hey, hurry up and gather your samples, make your way back to the LEM. So as they make their way out of the ship and they're returning to the rover, Levinov actually looks down, and in the lunar soil he spots 2 rows of parallel tracks which weren't made by their rover. They quickly recognize these as lunar rover tracks, and they get Houston back on the horn and they tell him that, hey, we've just found evidence of Apollo 19. So they get back to their lander and they get some rest. test, and they actually get ground control Houston back on the horn, and they essentially state, hey, we've found evidence of Apollo 19. I think there might be survivors. We should go and look for them. However, at this point, ground control is erring on the side of caution. They're thinking about not investigating what happened to Apollo 19 out of fear that what happened to them could happen to the crew members of Apollo 20. And they really don't want to see 3 failed missions in a row. Ground control is pretty much convinced that they are not going to find any survivors from Apollo 19, and that it is not really worth investigating any further. However, after this discussion, ground control comes around and says, okay, you can go investigate their lunar module. It's not far away. See what happened, and if you can find them, bring them home. So shortly after this, Levinov and Rutledge, they get into their rover and they make their way towards the Apollo 19 landing site. Now, when they got there, they had seen that it was still attached to its first stage booster, which was a sign that the astronauts hadn't left. However, Rutledge, he had kind of a sick feeling in his stomach. He thought he was going to open that hatch and find 3 corpses, with final messages to friends and family basically taped to the panels of the control module. So they head to the lunar module, and the first thing they notice is that the hatch is open, so it's not pressurized. So if there is anybody in there, they're dead. Now, seeing that the hatch was already open and the thing was depressurized, they started walking around the LEM, and they were essentially inspecting it for damage. Now, they had noticed that it had a hard landing and that the nozzle skirt was partially buried and folded, which meant that they were probably not going to go anywhere. And it was at this point when Rutledge kicked something in the dirt, which turned out to be a glove from Apollo 19. So while he was investigating this glove, Levinon had gone up the ladder and he had actually gone into the lunar lander, and he reports back that there's a body in here, but it's not human. So they both climb into the lunar module and they pressurize it, and they stand there in silence for about 2 minutes, because what's before them is something that they have never seen before. It was a humanoid-like creature buckled down to a table. She was about 5.5 feet tall, and she had 6 fingers on each hand, and she was covered in this waxy substance which they thought was some kind of advanced pressurized suit. And on her face there was this device that consisted of like these stalks which went to her nose and mouth and eyes. Now, she wasn't alive, however she wasn't dead. She was in this weird kind of suspended animation, and they determined this because after they had pressurized the landing module, they essentially examined the body, and Rutledge did most of the examination of the body while Levinov filmed this. Now, at about this time, Leona, orbiting up in the command module, she comes back into radio contact with Levinov and Rutledge, and she has news for them that Houston has instructed them that they want them to bring the alien body home. Furthermore, they receive news that the original crew of Apollo 19 was killed in that ship. Those plants that were on the walls essentially ate them. Ground control essentially tells them that they have established contact with the alien presence on the moon. They can take the body back with them to Earth. It's of no value to them, and that the members of the crew of Apollo 20 can leave in peace. So they make their way back to the lander, they redock with the command module, and they make their way back to Earth, a successful mission. After the body is brought back to Earth, it is immediately transported to Area 51 for further study. Rutledge, Snyder, and Levinov are put into isolation for a month, where they undergo a series of tests to make sure they didn't bring back any viruses or bacterial plagues or anything from their contact with these aliens. Levinov, he goes back to the Soviet Union, and being the good communist cosmonaut he is, he doesn't disclose any of this to anybody. Leona Snyder is essentially sworn to secrecy, given a new identity, and is scrubbed from the history books, and Commander Rutledge actually ends up living the rest of his life in Rwanda, where in 2006 he would finally tell his story. However, unfortunately, that's all it is. It's a story. Commander Rutledge didn't actually exist. This was all an internet hoax from the early days of YouTube. So what's the real story? The real story is in 2006, this French artist named Thierry Speth, as part of a science fiction film project he was working on, used a combination of practical effects and 3D to create videos of a supposed black budget, dark money NASA mission which would determine the possibility of alien life on the moon. And he released his videos on YouTube because YouTube was a new platform back around 2006. And these videos went viral, and it spun off a whole cadre of little internet myths surrounding Apollos 18, 19, and 20. Now, the reality with Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were they were planned, and there were astronauts chosen to go on those missions. However, those missions were scrubbed, mostly due to lack of public interest in the program and the shifting of mindsets at NASA, where they wanted to take NASA, they wanted to focus on new programs, they wanted to focus on space stations and low orbit stuff and getting the shuttle prepared and creating like the Hubble telescope and all this other stuff, all this stuff that they do today. And it really is sad because that shift in mindset also came with a shift in funding. Their funding was really ramped down after the success of the Apollo 11 mission, and it has been at an all-time low to this day. I mean, that's why it's 50 years later and we're just now starting to go back to the moon, albeit with better technology and the financial backing of private entities, and that's really caused a blossoming in what is now known as the current space race. It's taken 50 years, but we finally got Americans back on board with space exploration, which I think is awesome. Of course, personally, I think if we can funnel more money towards NASA and these private entities which are funding all this, and less money towards, I don't know, useless programs that don't do anything in other nations that me as an American don't really care about, we'd probably be able to get ourselves out of this economic slump we're in, and we'd probably be able to create thousands of more jobs across the nation. But hey, that's just my little political rant on that. Of course, a quick side note, speaking of jobs, you know all these people that work at like NASA and SpaceX and Blue Origin and I don't know, like Area 51 and stuff? How did they get those jobs? I've always wondered that, because it's not like you go on like LinkedIn or what's the other one, Indeed, and find jobs to be like, I don't know, the office manager at SpaceX or an accountant at NASA. Of course, I'm guessing a lot of people probably do that through like college work placement programs, but what if like a guy is like a janitor at NASA? How does that guy get that job? Or the guy who like, I don't know, like the guy that drives those white trucks around Area 51. I wonder how they get those jobs. If anybody knows, definitely let me know, because I've always kind of thought like, how do those people get into those positions? But I'm off on a tangent now. So Apollo 20, it's a great urban legend. It had been around since 2006. It went really viral and it kicked off all this internet debating about whether or not it was real, because the footage that you see in the little films on YouTube, some of the really good ones look really good, and if you only showed somebody that cherry-picked data, they'd probably believe it. However, it was about 9 years after all the internet fighting and speculation and whatnot that the artist finally came out and said, hey, I created this, and he actually had an interview where he holds up like the alien head that he created in his little workshop or whatever and said, yeah, I made this. It's a art project. I'm fascinated in sci-fi. I thought it would be a cool movie project and book idea. And it really was a great art project and book idea, because if it wasn't a great art project and a great book idea, it wouldn't have inspired almost a decade of people bickering back and forth as to whether or not this was real or a hoax. And hell, I wouldn't be talking about it today. And to be honest, I didn't really follow the book or the original little films or story. I kind of mishmashed this together from a lot of stuff I found from from around the internet into my own little epic story about these Apollo missions. Hell, Apollo 18 isn't even mentioned in this story. I actually lifted that from a 2011 movie by the same name. It was like this found footage horror movie. And what I discussed is essentially the plot without the introduction of the rock monsters. But it fit in so well with this narrative that I had to include it because I had to fill that hole between 17 and 19, which is kind of what I love about little conspiracy theories or urban legends and stuff. You can mold them to fit any kind of story you're trying to tell. They're malleable, and that malleability allows them to endure for a long time. And especially any kind of urban legend involving the United States and the Soviets during the Cold War. Those urban legends have endless possibilities because of the secretive nature of our governments, which is why I really love revisiting them. And as always, I know I glossed over a lot. There are rabbit holes that you can go down with this stuff that is insane, but this time I just kind of wanted to tell a cool little story that is just so outlandish and batshit crazy that it just creates a fun ride. And I really hope I did a good job at that. But with that all being said, once again, my name is Mike, this is Urban Legends and Mythology, and I do truly thank you for listening. And as always, this show does primarily grow through your word of mouth, so I don't know, tell your friends that you're listening to a cool podcast about urban legends and mythologies, or share one of my links on your Facebook or Instagram or whatever Twitter is now, x.com. Or if you are on x.com, share it with Elon Musk. He might think it's funny or stupid. I don't know how Elon Musk thinks. I'm not a billionaire. But aside from all that, once again, I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.